from CAFA's media department to do the introduction.
Thank you. Thank you. It's always nice to conclude by a round of applause. And thank you for having us today and for being here. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Ben Oldham. I'm the manager of CAFOD's work in the Diocese of Leeds. I think I've worked with a few of you over the past 12 months or so, because CAFOD has a partnership with the university based on our shared values and mission. But in essence, it's about providing you with the opportunity to gain some experience outside of your studies, but also giving people the opportunity to engage with social justice issues and find out a little bit more about international development as well. And as part of this partnership, CAFOD launched their One Climate, One World campaign regionally from this university, and there's a few of you in the room I know who were involved with that. And the aim of the campaign was really to put pressure on decision makers in Westminster to stop climate change from pushing people further into poverty, and also to try and empower people to take action in their own lives on this issue. And we worked very closely with some of the journalism students and with the different faculties across the university. And at the end of the day, the event that we had here generated the highest amount of social media content that CAFOD's had in one single day. So something that we're very proud of and something that you should all be really proud of as well. In addition, some of the journalism students wrote press releases for us and undertook interviews. And those press releases made it to the national titles and were published locally, but also some of the Catholic titles nationally as well, which was fantastic. And it's my pleasure to be joined here today by Debbie Wainwright, our head of regional media, and Mike Woolridge, the BBC's Foreign Affairs correspondent, to talk a little bit more about the relationship between charities and the media. And so without further ado, I'll pass you over to Debbie.
Hello, hi. Well, thank you for having us here today. So, as Ben said, I'm Debbie and I'm CAFOD's head of regional media. I've been at CAFOD in a number of different communications roles for the past 10 years. There's 4 of us in the media team, focusing on media outputs. And we also get to write for the web, we get to write content for all the social media, we get to take photos and videos, we get to travel overseas, so it's a very varied and exciting role. Before that, I was a regional journalist, local journalist. I'm not sure whether it's a reflection of my age or just how far technology's moved on, but my first newsroom echoed to the sounds of typewriters rather than the beep of computers. And cut and paste literally was cut and paste with some scissors and some glue. I don't know how we ever managed to get the newspaper out, but we did. So I said I've been in the charity comms for 10 years now. It might be hard to believe to you guys where communications is just the norm in this world of sort of 24-hour news and social media, but communications is still a relatively new function in the charity world. It's only about 20 years since charities started creating standalone communications departments with heads of communications or communications directors. Before it was a role of the fundraising who randomly sent out stories when they thought it was worthwhile. So as a result, communications and marketing are still sometimes seen as the icing on the cake for charities, the nice to have optional extra that tells people about the real work that charities are doing, like project work, the services or campaigning. However, the most successful charities already understand that communications is anything but peripheral. And when communications is made central to what an organisation is and does, they and their mission thrive. So communications and high-quality media coverage gives a charity the opportunity to not only talk about the work that they do and how that work transforms lives, but also challenges the structures that keep people needing our support. So as you know, the media in all its forms, print, radio, TV, online, all the social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, it goes on, can be the catalyst for change. For example, when the Chancellor George Osborne announced that there was going to be a cap on income tax reliefs, the voluntary sector went into complete campaign overdrive at the heart of it being media coverage and social media coverage at the heart of that campaign. Within 2 months, Osborne had reversed his decision, and we can argue that it's because of the high profile that the voluntary sector, the high profile in the media that the voluntary sector achieved about, why this wasn't a good thing. So the media helps bring about change, and if a charity like CAFOD wants to bring about change and influence politicians and society as a whole to take action on a particular issue such as climate change, then it must engage effectively with the media. engaging the media cannot simply be the icing on the cake. It's absolutely fundamental to making change happen, whether that be on a national or a local level. So when CAFOD covers its issues and stories, we are always looking to profile our message across the national, regional and online platforms. Readers, listeners and viewers who find out about something or read, hear, see something in the media automatically place a greater level of credibility to it. The attitude of most media consumers is, if you'll know this personally, is if the story gets into the pages of the newspaper, on the air, on the TV, then it's important and worth taking notice of. And therefore, it follows that that charity is important and worth taking notice of. So having a media profile as a charity not only gets you noticed by the general public, but also among the decision makers, VIPs and government. So those in government that could notice you can be at a local or national level, and because of that, the decision makers could become more likely to ask you for your group's input or opinion on the matters that are relevant to you, so you have a greater opportunity to make change. So the other thing about media is that CAFOD staff, like myself and Ben, can stand here and tell you till we're blue in the face, CAFOD's great, CAFOD does this, CAFOD does that. But when an external source, particularly a journalist, covers our story in a positive way, it gives greater legitimacy to our work. So through media coverage, CAFOD is not only able to reassure our current supporters that we're a charity that makes a difference and is worth backing, but also encourages new supporters. The more supporters, the more money, the more we can support people overseas with our programmes. The more campaigners, the more influence to bring about the change and challenge the structures that keep people living in poverty. Another big plus of media coverage for a charity is, of course, that it's free. CAFOD doesn't generally spend supporters' money on advertising, so it's even more crucial that we produce and pitch what we do in an eye-catching and innovative way. We need to stand out from the crowd and ensure it's CAFOD's story that the media chooses. So how does CAFOD get in the media? The media agenda is packed, it's competitive, it's tricky. There's a lot going on out there. So what we do, we build trust with journalists, we offer stories that fit in with the news agenda, that are relevant to audiences, are innovative, and of course are new, being news stories. Taking journalists out to visit our projects to highlight a particular issue and how we are dealing with it is particularly effective. So I've travelled with journalists from your own local paper here, the Yorkshire Post, out to Rwanda. So the paper got great coverage over the week with a story that was different to their usual content but was still relevant to their local readers. And CAFOD, of course, had its messages covered, its story covered, and the donations increased, I'm delighted to say. So that was a win-win all round. So CAFOD, along with other UK international development charities, have become an interesting source of information to journalists. Because for a charity like CAFOD, we work in countries or areas of countries that journalists sometimes are unable to reach, especially news with the 24-hour news agenda. So because we work through local partners, mainly church partners, we're in a really good position to offer the latest information. So for example, when the Boko Haram attacks happened in Baga, did I say Baga? Baga in Nigeria. The Independent on Sunday called saying, you know, what's happening? Can we have a local spokesperson on the ground? So we had the Archbishop of Jos, who was able to respond to that phone call and let that journalist know what was going on in his local area. So this kind of access is invaluable for journalists who need to constantly update in a 24/7 news cycle. So CAFOD can offer unique access and opportunities to foreign correspondents in the UK or those based overseas, largely because of our network with the church and the ability to access hard to reach places. Also, we may have materials for media that can be invaluable at a time when travel budgets are shrinking for many news media, such as photo galleries or B-roll video. So, to help us understand how this relationship between charities and media works or doesn't, and a unique insight into life as a world affairs correspondent, I'm really delighted to introduce today a journalist who has dedicated his life and work to highlighting all that goes on in our world. So Mike Woolridge has been reporting on world-changing events for the past 40 years, starting out as a local journalist in East Anglia, followed by a stint as a journalist with the charity VSO. He joined the BBC in 1970. So Mike has probably seen the best of human beings and the worst of human beings in his years as a journalist. There are far too many stories to mention right here, but just briefly, Mike has travelled around most of Africa, covering major stories such as the Ethiopian famine of 1984-85, civil conflicts in Mozambique and Angola, and humanitarian emergencies in Sudan and Somalia, as well as the death of Nelson Mandela. Mike has also reported from the Middle East and Asia, including Iraq, India, the Musharraf coup in Pakistan, and the US-led bombing in Afghanistan. Mike has also made documentaries, including $1 a Day, reporting from 8 countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America on the different factors that make it difficult for many to escape from living on below $1 a day, and looking at what can lift people out of that trap. So I am now delighted to hand over to Mike to inspire you in your future careers. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Debbie. Actually, very interesting. I found it, and I hope you did too, listening to that perspective from Debbie of the relationship between charities and the media. And I'm going to come back to that in just a little while, if I may, to talk about that from my perspective of a journalist, as a journalist, because, but the thing I would say immediately is that relationship will vary considerably in terms of different kind of media. Not everybody will have the same relationship with charities, but very interesting to hear that that view of it and of the huge value that you were saying that it has for charities themselves. I thought that I would start in Djibouti. Why not? And by the way, may I just say, it's absolutely great to be here, and you've already got, I think, a considerable advantage over me, all of you, as far as I can see. I imagine, are you all students here, or is anybody from outside? Everybody's. Anybody from outside the university? No, everybody's here. Oh, one of you. But you've all got an advantage over me. You've all done something I haven't done, because as was often the case of somebody who entered journalism as long ago as I did, I didn't go to university. I was studied at college and went straight into, not straight into the BBC, but straight into my newspaper in East Anglia. The Lowestoft Journal was the first paper that I was on from school at the age of 17. So you're ahead of me already, and I'm sure with all of you with great careers to come, far more successful than I've been. But I thought I would begin in Djibouti, which, as I'm sure you will all know, put your finger on it on the map immediately, is on the northeast coast of Africa. Not only one of the smaller countries in the world, but is also one of the hottest countries in the world. The temperature in the hottest season goes up to 50 degrees Celsius, and I can testify to that, having been there at that time. But I wanted to begin in Djibouti on a particular day when I was there in the mid-1980s, I think it was 1986. And I was there to attend, and this is the heat has something to do with this, I was there to attend a regional intergovernmental meeting on drought and desertification. An important meeting, quite obviously, a subject like that, but pretty routine, and it wasn't necessarily going to produce the most galvanizing kind of journalism and world headlines. But while I was there, I think I'd only been there a day, and there was an uprising, a coup in Aden, just across the water, the other side of the Red Sea. And I was, perhaps not surprisingly, the closest BBC journalist on the globe to Aden at the time. We didn't actually have anybody in Aden at that point. So I think I was around 100 miles away, I think in a straight line between Djibouti and Aden. And again, as you can imagine, and this was an uprising that was looking pretty ugly. There were already foreigners who were trying to flee town with difficulty, running to the beaches. There was violence in the streets that was occurring. And obviously the BBC had a big appetite for whatever I could find out about what was going on, to cover it as best I could. And the drought meeting had to take second place to that, at least while this story was on. And I heard, as I tried to find a way of covering it and getting across to Aden, there was no immediately obvious way of doing that, but what I heard was that a seaman on a ship that had just come in from Aden, that had crossed to Djibouti, had some pictures of the uprising taking place. So I went down to the docks to try and find him, got on board the ship and spoke to him, and he said he wanted, I saw his pictures, and he said he wanted $5,000 for them. Now, you wouldn't get away with doing this today in the BBC, but I agreed on the spot to the sum, assuming the BBC would back it. These days it has to go through several layers of decision making, I can assure you. And I said I would go and find that $5,000 and come back and get his pictures, and would he kindly sell them to nobody else in the meantime who might turn up. But of course the question was, I mean, I don't think I had $5 on me. Where on earth do you get? And this I remember was pretty much towards the end of the day. It was into the evening. Where do you come across $5,000 to be able to buy these pictures and get them off to the BBC? Now, it so happened that the British consul in Djibouti, I think we still have one today, but we certainly had one then. The British consul in Djibouti, not a full-time diplomat, he was a man who ran a bank, the bank, I think, in Djibouti. And so I found out where he lived. I went round to his house. You would all do exactly the same thing, I know, with all your journalism expertise. Went round to his house, and I said, I need $5,000. And so I had to explain, obviously, why I might need that. And fortunately, he was thoroughly enthused by the whole business. And so he agreed to arrange for that to happen. We were at his house. He said if I came back a little later, we could go to the bank, and he would indeed have that taken out, arrange for that, so that I could take it away and go and get these pictures. You know, the BBC's authority. I had to prove to him that I worked for the BBC. And sure enough, at whatever time it was, by then it must have been midnight, I think, we both went along together to the bank, and I came away with $5,000 in cash in a brown envelope, and went back to the ship and gave it to the seaman, and he handed over the pictures. And fortunately, and I had checked this out beforehand, there was an Air France flight that was passing through Djibouti later that night on its way to Paris, and so I worked out that if I went along to the airport, which I then did, and gave them, and again, you can't do that so easily today, you give it to somebody to hand carry to London, as indeed we had much of our material in journalism hand carried to London at that time from distant parts of the world. And I managed to succeed in doing all of that and getting the pictures to London. Incidentally, I only discovered later that that was reasonably under the nose of an ITN reporter who had arrived during the course of the day and was also looking for pictures, and no doubt if he got his hands on them would have outbid me and we'd have had to pay more. So he and I had a bit of a joke about that later on. Pictures got to London, got used. I have to this day never dared check whether they thought that that was the right thing to have done and whether they supported my spending $5,000 on them, but at least I didn't hear to the contrary. I think it was the following day that we don't have it anymore, the Royal Yacht Britannia pitched up in Djibouti. It was on a passage from, I think it was from, the Queen wasn't on board, or any other member of the royal family. It was on a passage from Britain to Australia, if I recall, where the Queen was to join it for a royal trip. And so it came in, I think, to refuel. And immediately when in Djibouti, got orders to go and take part in the rescue of foreigners, literally from the beaches, over the water, 100 miles away in Aden. And so I went down again to the dock and asked if I could see the senior officer on board, who I think it was an admiral, actually, being the Royal Yacht. And I said, he told me what they'd been tasked to do. And smaller boats were going to take people off the beaches and to the Britannia, and it was going to come back to Djibouti with them. All sounded great. Of course, again, all of you would want to do the same thing. You want to take a ride on the Britannia so you could go over and witness this happening and talk to the people. The senior officer also thought that was a good idea, but unfortunately said he'd have to check with London, come back when they were going to sail, which several hours later. I did so. By the time I got back, he said, I'm afraid to say the Ministry of Defence in London haven't given authorization for it. So I couldn't join the Britannia going over, but the French came to the rescue. There was a French naval vessel in Djibouti as well, the Jules Verne, and I, and indeed other reporters who'd gathered at this point, we went over towards Aden. They were also going to be rescuing people, foreigners, from this uprising and bringing them out. And they did us the great favor of lifting us in a helicopter from the French ship, the Jules Verne, over and winching us down onto the deck of the Britannia so we could at least return to Djibouti and interview people who had been rescued, which we did, told us very stirring stories of what had happened in Aden, and we were able to use the ship's radio to get the story out to the BBC. So the whole thing had a pretty dramatic quality about it. The kind of thing you get to do occasionally in journalism. But why did we have to use the ship's radio? This was before the days of satellite phones, of mobile phones. Not that a mobile phone would have necessarily been much use there out on the waters, but the crew at least allowed us to use that for our communications. A decade later, just over a decade later, end of the 1990s, again, it seemed to be an ordinary day in the office in Delhi when I was the BBC's South Asia correspondent. At the time I was in Djibouti, I was the East Africa correspondent for the BBC. And this was 6 months after the election in India that had been won by the BJP-led coalition. And we got a call in the office saying that the Prime Minister, at that time Atal Bihari Vajpayee, was going to give a news conference. Now, not a regular event for sure. It wasn't that often that an Indian Prime Minister gave a news conference, but not necessarily exceptional. No reason to be particularly surprised. Hour or so later, we were all on the lawn of his residence for this mystery news conference. Mr. Vajpayee walks out of the residence to address the media and announced, I wonder if any of you would have any guess as to what he might have announced. No? He walked out to announce that India had just conducted 5 underground nuclear tests. Now, if you can imagine that, you are absolutely not expecting this in any way. There'd been nothing that had foreshadowed this. Prime Minister of a country that they had tested before, back in 1974, but there'd been effectively a moratorium since then. And this, remember, is happening at a time when there was great pressure on governments that had nuclear weapons capability not to carry out any further tests, not to develop nuclear weapons capability any further, not to do anything that could proliferate the use of nuclear weapons, lead to an arms race. And here they are in a very, very volatile region of the world, particularly at that time with Pakistan, with all the likelihood that if India tested, Pakistan would follow suit. The two countries had been at war. There was tension between them, unresolved disputes like Kashmir. All of the things that would rattle the world and really frighten it when they carried out nuclear tests. And here I am, along with all my colleagues, suddenly with this absolute bombshell, if that's the right word, announcement. Quite an extraordinary. I don't think I've ever been to a press conference quite of that kind, when you get a press conference which you had no idea what it was going to be about. Rushed to the car in the car park to file that live from there, and then back to the office to do TV packages and more lives and so on. All my colleagues in the BBC and in other media all doing the same. An absolutely astonishing story. Those of you who know your history of that time may well remember that 3 weeks, or remember, but may well know that 3 weeks later, Pakistan, despite huge pressure on it not to carry out any nuclear tests of its own, everybody knew it might have been developing the capability to do so, went ahead and carried out those nuclear tests. And there was really, well, it exists today to some extent, that could become a flashpoint that had a region for, as a potential as a nuclear weapons flashpoint, as a source of a nuclear arms race. So they followed suit. Now, I'm not saying that the uprising in Aden and the nuclear tests announcement are in any way typical days in journalism. They most certainly aren't. But I think that experiences like that do point to one of the great rewards and excitements of a career in journalism. And I would say for me it's that unpredictability. I was trying to think what single word might make this just such an extraordinarily exciting career for us, for you to be becoming involved in, and for me to have been in for some years. I think it's quite probably the unpredictability of it. Those happen to be major international stories, but really wherever you're practicing journalism, the unpredictability can be the same. I remember in my very, very early in my days on the Lowestoft Journal, so 50 years ago this year, I was in the office at lunchtime and there was a call from BP because there was exploration at that stage for natural gas in the North Sea. And there was a call saying if you can be down at the helicopter pad in 10-15 minutes, you can come and see the first flaring of what looks like it's going to be commercial quantities of natural gas in this sector of the North Sea. Rushed down there with a photographer, we went out, and that's what we got. We got very dramatic pictures from the helicopter, a gas rig of that first flaring. And again, a bit like Delhi, a bit like Djibouti, you know, rush back and the thrill of handling that story of a first in Lowestoft. And the story went beyond Lowestoft, you know, we got it into the Eastern Daily Press, the bigger regional paper, and the next morning, and of course taken up nationally as well. And to be honest, ever since those days, I would say that it's been not just a huge privilege to be a journalist, but a privilege to witness the things we do. Perhaps even more importantly, to meet the kind of people that you meet in the course of journalism, to hear their stories. And to have both the opportunity and with it the responsibility that you have to try to help make sense of the world. And I use the world in every sense, the local world as well as the bigger world, your local community, your region, as well as on a world stage, because that's what we do, to try to understand ourselves, why things happen as they do, and to try to communicate that. The cliche has it that what we do in journalism is we have a seat at a ringside seat at history in the making. There's all sorts of other ways of phrasing that, but I think that as time goes on, you do have a sense of that. That can all sound very high-minded. It can sound very pretentious. It can sound pompous, and I don't mean it to be that way. But I think that certainly if you're working for an independent public broadcaster of a kind that the BBC is, I don't think that you should see it as your professional role to in any way try to change the world, and you're likely to end up pretty frustrated and disappointed if you have that as your ambition, of course. But I do think that we can aspire to be part of making the world better informed, and that maybe that will help lead to some better decisions being made. Over the years, I have found myself reporting on very many extraordinary and momentous events, as you say, the release of the death of Nelson Mandela, but before that, 20 years before that, the release from prison of Nelson Mandela as well, which again was one of those just extraordinary, you knew the whole world was watching, was listening in. That was an extraordinary thing to be involved in. For me as a radio reporter covering that particular story, I wound up outside the prison that he was released from, realizing that there was nowhere I could actually tell the story. I was going to need to do, like, we got at very short notice that he was going to be released, got down there, and this again was before the days of mobile phones, before the days of satellite phones. I suddenly realized I had no way, there was no house nearby outside the prison, there was no phone box. How on earth was I going to report this extraordinary story that the whole world was going to need to hear me tell in just a few hours' time? And I really have had a bit of luck in my life, because a telephone engineer, an Afrikaner telephone engineer, drove past, pulled up, and he said, what's going on here today? So we told him, and we told him, so you're from the post office, telephone engineer? He said, yep. I said, got a dilemma here. I need to be able to phone live to the BBC to tell my story. And cut a long story short, what he did, there was a telephone line passing, just literally, you know, poles and wire going overhead, and that Afrikaner telephone engineer agreed on signing of a contract, 240 rand for the day, to drop down. He climbed up on a ladder, dropped down a telephone wire, put a handset on the end of it, rented it to me, and I stood on the top of my little hired Volkswagen City Golf and spent the whole afternoon reporting live as Nelson Mandela came out of the prison, his arm in Winnie Mandela's, his wife at that stage, of course, reported all that live, described the scene, thanks to that telephone line that I was able to hire for the day. And the line held up. So there was that, the Ethiopian famine that you mentioned, and in fact quite a few natural and man-made disasters. And in 2010, which is where we start to connect with charities, start to connect with CAFOD specifically, I was one of those in the BBC who went to report the Haiti earthquake. And you may well remember that obviously there'd been just a few years earlier, the huge focus on the Asian tsunami, killing roughly 250,000 people. Well, the Haiti earthquake, in an extraordinarily small, concentrated area, killed roughly the same number of people. It was at least 230,000 people. It was of all the disasters I've covered, I think that was one of the hardest to grasp when you drove into Port-au-Prince, the capital, and you come over a bit of a ridge and you drive down and you just saw the whole city destroyed, the whole government taken out. It was quite an extraordinary thing. I'm just going to play you now just a little bit of one of the radio reports time, just give you a sense of the sort of thing you might find yourselves doing if you are foreign reporters covering disasters, but it will take us into the role that a charity, and in particular CAFOD, played in this as well. So let's see if we can just do this.
My name is Thomas Edward. You are situated in a place that is called Shanmas, which is a park of recreation. You would never be able to recognize that fact because everything has changed overnight.
Well, and we're right in the midst now of all these very temporary dwellings.
That is correct.
Cotton sheets, plastic sheets on the roof.
Things that is made of card boxes, woods, cloth, anything that they could find their hands on, they would use and to make up houses.
How soon do you think things might start to get better?
I cannot see it. They have nowhere to go. They have no means to survive. If it wasn't the little help that foreign aids, and should be pure anarchy. People would be one trying to kill one another for a piece of bread.
Turning the corner and coming up some steps. Here's a standpipe with 6 taps on it, and lots of children in particular coming up and collecting buckets of water. And over here is Helter, who's just sitting on a bed frame with her small child, Luca. How many of you are living under here, under this sheet?
There are 8 families living under these plastic sheets, but I live out here. I have no cover, nothing. When it rains, I have to stay here with my baby. I can't live in this situation with my baby. I can't find a tent. Haitian men came the other day and promised us some tents, but I never saw them again.
Now, I played that just to give you a feel of what the situation was like there. That was 3 weeks, somewhere between 3 weeks and a month after the earthquake. We went out in the way that BBC, perhaps more than others, with the number of outlets that we have to report for, all our different networks. We went out in waves, really, and I went out on the second or third wave of reporting at that 3 weeks to 1 month on stage. And at that time, as I think you'll have experienced yourself, there's very often the first what you're reporting the scale of it, then you're reporting the type of aid that is going to be necessary. Around about, you probably agree with this, around about that 2-3 week stage after any disaster, a lot of the questions are coming in. Why hasn't more got in? Why isn't there better coordination? It all seems so chaotic and so on. And that was the case with this particular disaster, as with any of them. But there was another dimension to it, I think, and this is where CAFOD comes in particularly. So I was reporting all that, and that was just a description of the scene in the middle of the city and the huge difficulties people were still facing. But I think not only did it take out the capital city in ways that so rarely happen and effectively take out the government, the country really had to start from scratch again. The traumatic impact of that disaster was probably bigger and more intense than almost any other I can remember, apart from the Ethiopian famine of the mid-80s, and that because of its scale, with more than 1 million people dying. But here, there was a real kind of spiritual component. It seemed to hit and undermine the spirit of Haiti in many ways. And Matthew Carter, head of emergencies, I think, what's his title at, is it head of emergencies, head of humanitarian operations, at CAFOD, who's a friend, had told me he'd just been there, and we kind of crossed over, and he said, get in touch with the bishop, one of our partners there. You'll get a bigger sense, I think, of what is happening, which I did. And as a result, not only did I absolutely pick that up, and that informed quite a lot of the reporting that I did, but also he told me of a very particular event. And again, this has completely stayed with me among the more extraordinary things that I've witnessed. Exactly on the 1 month anniversary, they had a service that took place in the ruins of the National Cathedral in the middle of Port-au-Prince. What nobody else went out to cover, and probably nobody else knew about it, just happened that the bishop told me. He said, if you can be out at 6:30, 7 o'clock on that morning, the day 1 month on from the earthquake, we're going to have a ceremony of some kind. We're going to try to do something on the huge mass graves that had been created. Something like, and I don't think anybody knows to this day how many people were buried there. It was done so quickly for health reasons. Something like 150,000 people have been buried there, who died in the earthquake. And it so happens that the site they had chosen was about 15 kilometers north of Port-au-Prince, in some low hills, quite an eerie place. And one reason it was eerie was that very close by was where a lot of people had been buried who were victims of the very violent dictatorships of Haiti, the Duvalier dictatorships. Victims of the Tonton Macoute, who were the agents who used to go around and lots of political killings at that time. So it was a place that many Haitians just didn't want to go to, had terrible associations for them, and it was barely 300-400 yards away from where now many of the victims of the earthquake had also been buried. So that morning, the bishop, some of his colleagues, decided to hold almost a purification ritual. It was a mass, but it was more than that, on top of the new mass graves for the earthquake victims. And maybe for this reason of the associations of the place, very, very few people were there. 1 or 2 foreign aid workers who got to know about it, and just a few Haitians were there. Probably no more than 50 people, all told. Short mass in the open air, right on top, literally on top of where people had just been freshly buried. And they went round and did a sort of purification, sprinkling water, said prayers, and that was it. But an incredibly haunting thing to attend or indeed to report on. And so I did. I mean, I did report on it. I reported on that live on radio, and then we did pieces on that. And it's not often that you get to either experience something like that or to find yourself reporting that. So that's the kind of thing that without that kind of contact, inside assistance, I certainly wouldn't have known about and would have probably missed altogether. I think that probably, just to draw this together before questions, and address what you're talking about, Debbie, is that I suppose, again, apart from the unpredictability being the theme right through the career, very often the stories that I've found myself doing, being stories about development, whatever you want to call them, stories about humanitarian assistance, but stories about vulnerability, the kind of vulnerability that is most exposed when you get a disaster, but of course the vulnerability that's day in, day out, here in many ways in our own society, but also in the developing world, the places where I've been based and reported from longest. A number, as you said, I did voluntary service overseas and did VSO in Uganda. It's a place, again, I feel a particular connection with. I did it as a journalist, working information work for the cooperatives for 2 years, right back in the late 1960s. But going back there to report since then, it's been very interesting to see ways in which Uganda has changed and been affected by huge political developments. You probably all know the name Idi Amin, who brought a particular kind of terror and dictatorship to Uganda in the 1970s, many victims, but it's not the only period when Uganda's experienced great instability. So it's a nation that's had to work through that politics that has very rarely been of any help to people. Things are different there today, but it's still a struggle and there's still an effect from that history, most certainly. 4 years ago, I went there to report on a very interesting project called the Millennium Village. There are something like 10 of these Millennium Villages all over Africa, set up by the economist Jeffrey Sachs, the author of The End of Poverty, very influential in the application of the Millennium Development Goals, has his own approach to seeing how those Millennium Development Goals can be achieved, which of course expire this year to be replaced by things called the Sustainable Development Goals. And we went 4 years ago to look at his project, which was largely about almost bombing a cluster of villages with aid, a much higher than usual amount of aid. He's argued that you can accelerate the process of development, of tackling extreme poverty, if you do it in an integrated way, health, education, agriculture, radios, got community radio stations, all at the same time, and at higher than normal levels of aid. End result will be, he believes, communities that can sustain themselves, that have seen high levels of development. Nobody wants to retreat from that afterwards. Sets an example to the rest of the country, to the government, enthusiastic to take this up. Well, the jury's still out. But I did can we just show a little bit of the video? I did a piece on it then, and I just want to show you a bit of it now on his project, the Millennium Villages in southwestern Uganda, a place called Ruhira.
It's a scene you would find across much of rural Uganda. McLean Mugisha is chopping down bunches of Matoki bananas that will end up on sale in a distant market. But life has changed in recent times for her and her husband Paolo, and their income is no longer so dependent on this one crop. Thanks to the Millennium Village project, they now have more cows and goats, and they no longer live in a mud-walled home, but in the brick one next door. We didn't have enough food before, McLean says, and now we do. We didn't have money, and now we have money. Making a difference to entire communities is what this aid project claims to do by targeting a specific area with substantial funding and working with the local people and administration. School feeding programs, a key example, a way of getting children in poor areas like this to go to school and stay there. Critics have suggested there's the risk the Millennium Villages end up as islands of success in a sea of failure. Here in Uganda, they're trying to make sure that won't happen.
I think we have done our job of getting the lessons out. We have done our job in sharing these lessons with government. Government is promising to get more money. The donors are promising, to provide money. I'll be disappointed if this good lessons are not replicated.
But the challenge of making a lasting impact here is acute. The remoteness, one reason Ruhira has been notorious until now for high mortality among women in pregnancy and childbirth and among the under fives. The Millennium Village project's given a high priority to improving healthcare, and it's showing results. On the front line now are community health workers. They go from house to house, checking on the children. Malnutrition has been a severe problem. 21-month-old Edison Mugunya turns out to have malaria, but at least now he gets treated. Lifting Africa out of poverty has in reality much more to do with trade and investment and economic management than with aid. But the very poorest often miss out, and aid arguably still has a critical role to play in overcoming inequality and ultimately ending poverty. The Millennium Villages have sprung up as an ambitious new way of trying to force the pace across Africa. The pressure's already on to demonstrate the wider benefits in Uganda, in particular from those living near Ruhira. It's been tough for this family to make a living since Sawori Mugumi's father died.
We don't have good schools for our children. We don't have enough medical care for our families and the environment people that are living. And we have poor transport network.
And even if such hurdles are eventually overcome with the help of the Millennium Village over the hill, what can't be answered yet is when aid of any kind will no longer be needed. Mike Woolridge, BBC News, southwestern Uganda.
And I hope to go back actually to Uganda in just a few weeks' time to really to see how much, among other things, to see how much has changed, to see whether those ambitions have been fulfilled and how far that part of the world at least does seem to be on the way towards the Millennium Development Goals. There are many people who believe that this method won't necessarily have reduced the inequality in an area like that, and I think that'll be the real test of it. And I think that just to come back to the particular role that charities play in all of this, and CAFOD perhaps particularly, I would absolutely bear out what you said about many of the things that you feel that CAFOD and other charities can offer the media in the way that we work. But I do think there's one fundamentally important thing from a journalist point of view in this, which is that, and you were using the word campaigning quite a lot, you were talking about campaigns for change and so on. You campaign, we report. And I do think that that sometimes gets overlooked in the, and indeed can sometimes lead to some of the difficulties that there are sometimes in the working out of that relationship. I mentioned already the example from Haiti, where the contacts that we have, the contacts that you have in charities that we often don't, can be immensely valuable, and you can see the results in journalism every day. Charities, NGOs, very often have a degree of frontline, day in, day out experience that hardly anybody else in the business of development has, either through their own employees or through the partnerships that they have. It's all incredibly valuable, absolutely no doubt about that. And that's the relationship at its best, I think. But I know I've certainly experienced that there can be a frustration, almost a lack of understanding sometimes in NGOs. Why aren't you reporting this or that campaign of ours? Or why aren't you giving it the degree of attention that we feel that it should have? But I think the answer would usually be that, as I say, we do a different job, and I think it's right that we do. We are as independent of charities as we are of anybody else, whether it's the military or business or politicians. And indeed, I think you would agree that charities and the work that they do should be open to scrutiny and challenge and tested in exactly the same way that would be the case with any of those other forces in society. And I do also think that one of the other, just mentioned it there in that piece to camera, one of the other big things about development is the way it's changing so hugely. And although in a way today NGOs still punch above their weight in their public profile in the context of development and humanitarian assistance, there are so many other forces now business in particular, investment, remittances, all the many other dimensions, the part that the military do play in dealing with Ebola in West Africa just recently, for example. Back in Haiti, the American military played a huge role initially in the first month in delivering aid there. All of them today, players in the whole business of humanitarian assistance and development, all of which we should be and do report. In the midst of all that, charities have generally been, and theirs is a very competitive world like ours, when it comes to fundraising and so on, and clamouring for attention, do in fact achieve a remarkable degree of attention, and rightly so. I'm going to pause there with the time being what it is.